Parker, and today it is my honor to be able to have a conversation with the wonderful Kevin Chopson. Kevin is the current Poet Laureate of Gallatin, Tennessee. He's also a four-time Pushcart Prize nominee for poetry. He is a amazing conceptual artist. He is a performance artist, a filmmaker, and I believe you're called an experimental filmmaker, which I really want to talk about, and a musician. Kevin, you do so many things. I'm just so impressed. Welcome to our program.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Kevin, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's a very long story, but we'll try to simplify it. I come from Detroit, Michigan, basically blue collar town. None of my peers went to college. I decided to go to Ypsilanti, Michigan, to English major in English at Eastern Michigan University.
Hmm.
Throughout my life, I've gone through a number of jobs and ultimately became an academic many years down the road. I was into my 40s before I became an academic. Then I had a 20-year teaching career, and poetry sort of weaved its way through that in various ways.
Well, Kevin, tell us about what actually drew you to writing.
Well, I think I've been a creative my entire life. There's sort of incidences that, in retrospect, because it's not the first time I've been asked the question. So you think about, why poetry, or whatever the case might be. I remember being very small, maybe 3 or 4 years old, and playing with my older sisters and making mud pies, and they would stir there. I just remember this vision of some sparkly rocks going into those mud pies, and I know that that intrigued me.
Mm.
Similarly, in the neighborhood, we were making tanks out of cardboard boxes. This is like the first full generation after World War II.
Oh, wow.
And I remember getting quite a kick out of that as well. And so I think that was the sparks of creativity. So I started like engaging in fictional activities with neighborhood kids, in which, without knowing it, I was sort of writing the script in my head. They would always go to me in terms of, well, what do you think? Oh, I think we should do this, or I think we should do that. And then the writing thing slowly evolved when I was headed toward my teens.
Well, Kevin, one of the things that I find it interesting is that you are considered a performance artist and a conceptual artist. So, for some of us who aren't familiar with those type roles, what is the difference? And then how did that come about in your life?
Well, a conceptual artist is someone who conceives of the work and how they want it to roll out. And the idea is almost more important than anything. And I don't mean like a broad idea, like I'm going to paint um, a tree lined lake forest, and then you go and paint that tree lined lake forest. It's more abstract. You think, I
Hmm.
want to speak to the power of nature. And then you address that within your piece, regardless if it looks like the power of nature to someone else or not. So it's all in the conception of what you want your end result to be. And in postmodern times in which we live, that's kind of changed
Hmm.
a little bit, but that's sort of the general idea. Now, with performance artists, you could say, well, almost anyone who performs live is a performance artist, aren't they? Whether they're reading poetry or playing the piano or whatever the case might be. But conceptual performance artists think of what they might want to demonstrate with an end purpose. A lot of what I do is Dada, based on the Dada movement from 1916, in which they presented a lot of nonsense to shake people up in terms of realizing that World War I, this was in 1916, was a terrible, nonsensical thing that we all were being sort of sucked into at the time, if one were
Hmm.
alive back then. And so they thought in mirroring that nonsense to their audience, the audience would react to that, like, what is going on? And their point being, even though they would never explain themselves, the point being, why aren't you reacting the same way to what's happening in the world?
So it's on
So
a broader picture.
yes, yes. And as a performance artist, I incorporate all sorts of elements into what I do. I do poetry in my Dada shows. I do poetry, I do song, I do noise music, I create mini plays within plays and ask other actors to perform these sort of nonsensical sort of elements, but then sort of thread moments of uh, some things that are easier for people to grab onto so they don't walk away. You know, they might just say, oh, this is weird. I don't get it. And then all of a sudden, okay, that sounds like a traditional song.
Oh,
What's up with that? So it's a really sort of involved and complicated thing to talk about, because theory nowadays in art, which evolved in the late 60s into the 70s, became very important, the theory of what you were doing rather than what it actually looked like. So that's kind of my basic premise almost for everything I do, except when I'm doing traditional, when I'm playing the Poet Laureate of Gallatin. Uh, I see that as more my role to write things that make sense and sort of support and ground the community.
well, and as the poet laureate, you probably get the opportunity to see all kinds of expressions of art. How does that impact your own style when you see others?
Well, to be honest, um, I really am not one to seek out. We don't have a whole lot of local art in Gallatin in terms of what I consider art. Actually, in this part of the world, I think we see a lot of craft, but not necessarily a lot of art. You know, so I'll travel into Nashville and do the. I think it's still the first Saturday art crawl. So that's the closest gallery scene to here.
Hmm.
And I might go to poetry readings again if there's someone that I want to see. More than likely, they're in Nashville. Um, so I've sort of created my own things for myself and other people to see here. I sponsor an avant-garde film festival, which I seek out independent experimental films, and then I'll show them in a pub some night somewhere, and continue to do that sort of thing and do it best I can.
You know, I've got some pictures that you've seen, and in this picture, you look very traditional, Kevin.
Yes, thank you.
And then it's a wonderful picture. And then this one, um, it's just beautiful. Can you tell us a little bit about this one?
Well, I do what I call devised photography, stealing the idea from what is a devised theater, where there's a script to the play and you involve people in this play, but it's open for each actor to sort of take the piece in different directions that might surprise the fellow actors. So I've applied that to photography, and I'll take pictures. This is a self-portrait of myself
Beautiful.
in which I take the photograph, and this is by Griffin Dunn, who this is not one of my works, but I do a lot of masking in my work, so that's from him. But in
Wow.
my device photography work, I shoot things, and then I start blowing them up and blowing them up and saturating and filtering them until I believe I've discovered what I was searching for. So in that sense, it's devised. And then when I come to that point, almost at that same time, a poetic title usually will just drop in place.
Oh, that's amazing. And here you are showing your work at a festival, which I think is really neat.
Yes,
And then
last year's Juneteenth festival, they asked me to write a poem celebrating Juneteenth last year here in Gallatin. So I did that. It was a cool thing.
this is Reality Disrupted.
Yes, I was invited to the Isle of Wight in 2021 to do my Dada show. And after going there in 2021, I met a number of people in the art community, and they had heard that I was doing devised photography in 2023 last year. They asked me to send some of my work, and so my devised photography work, including the one you just showed with 17 other pieces, was shown at this Reality Disrupted exhibition in Vintnor on the Isle of Wight. And then I streamed in a live Dada show to that same gallery that evening. It was a fantastic opportunity for me.
That is neat.
This is in my backyard. I also do installations. These are called the Three Golden Furies.
Oh,
And they're those three branches in particular. We had a sycamore tree, and a couple of years ago we had a really bad storm, and our mammoth sycamore tree came down. And so I culled these three branches and set them aside, and then ultimately primered them and painted them gold, and put them in concrete in the yard. And so they sort of symbolize the Greek Furies in mythology that sort of bring their fury down on people who are guilty of various things. So those stand in my yard along with a roofing vent in the center, which occasionally I put out there to decrease the heat of that guilt and or fury.
and here you are performing.
Yes, this is one of those traditional song elements inside of my Dada show, to where it's, two or three or four things where people may not really understand what's going on. Sometimes it's silliness and reasonably entertaining, but then ultimately, periodically throughout the evening, I'll just pick up the guitar and play a song. And that helps keep people engaged and allows them to be aware that I'm very aware of what a lot of what I do is non-traditional, because here's something that is traditional.
Yeah. I love the fact that you have so many layers to your ability to share your heart and what you got going on in there. And it sounds like there's a lot going on in there, Kevin. Um,
Well, thank
Kevin,
you.
I would love to hear some of your work. Would you read for us?
Sure. I guess what I would do is I'd read something that's relatively new. It's probably a month old. And this kind of fits into what I try to do as Poet Laureate of Gallatin. I might write pieces about places in Gallatin.
Mhm.
I've composed a piece on Comer Barn and was asked to read at a fundraiser for Comer Barn. I've written about Cragfont, which is an old Federal Times building here. But I also like to ground my poems in real life local characters. I'm sort of an old-fashioned pub poet over the past 5 or 6 years, meaning I like to go to pubs and drink and hang out and record lines from people that are just sitting and having a good time, or just sit and see what I might come up with on my own. And one night I was sitting at Prince Street, and there was someone who waved at me, and I waved back. And then I wrote this poem. It's called Wave. Wave broadly, spread those fingers wide like you would when you were a child, when time moved as slow as molasses soaking into cornbread. And Julian said, Amen, amen, amen. So he was a guy who happened to be there when I finished the poem. I read those few lines to him, and he said, Amen. And so I was able to then insert him into the poem, but I always only use first names. And generally, when I send something to the Gallatin News, we've got a good relationship. I don't overstay my welcome, but I'll send them little poems and they'll publish them. And so Julian, or people who know Julian or who were in that moment, will go, oh, I was there. And I do that periodically. And those poems are just simple little poems that I use to connect with the community, and I only send out to my local paper. So I'll read another one to just give you an example of that sort of thing. This one's called Golden Tap. Skipping the line, sipping on a Scottish ale, followed by a short smoked porter, bleeding out lines, whipping out cliches from centuries lost and broken, tripping down the lane, mapping out memories with Zach and Brooklyn, close and closer. Two people that I don't know very well, but I know their names, Zach and Brooklyn, happen to be sitting right next to me. So it's a way of sort of grounding that poem in real life characters. By writing the poem, them getting to know how one may look at the world
Right.
that they inhabit. I guess what I'll read is one of my, I guess every poet has a greatest hit, or greatest hits that are acknowledged for whatever reason they might be. And back when I was teaching, I went back to school and got my MFA in creative writing, focus on poetry from Murray State up in Kentucky. And fortunately for me, I rather quickly became published, and a number of times in the English Journal, which is what teachers of English, it's a reference point for teachers of English nationally and internationally.
Mhm.
So I had a half a dozen poems in the English Journal, probably over 4 years. And so that really helped me get into other journals and allowed me to be involved in other readings. And this is one of those poems that found its way into the English Journal. It's called The Purple. The purple rests on the horizon in a fuzzed out flat line of its own, a narrow swath above the just dead sun, in the movement of the tops of trees, a static charge between the naked winter limbs of hackberry, cottonwood, and oak. The purple, in a deeper hue, shows itself on the Bermuda onion, the eggplant, a storm-primed sky, and the bruise on a child's arm. In the almost black of the Queen of Night tulip, and a jagged leaf of cannabis indica, in the button made from shell. The purple is always there, in the eyes or just below the skin, in the lineage of royalty, soaked into the robe of God, in the line between what is and what will be. Thank you. Thank you.
Kevin, what would you say to that burgeoning writer or performer? What advice have you been given or that you would like to partake and give to them?
Well, I've been given very little advice separate from what we almost all receive, no matter what kind of art we're doing, is you probably shouldn't do that. Or why would you want to do that? So, in terms
That's
of
terrible.
genuine, yeah, terrible. But in terms of genuine, perhaps uplifting advice, I went to hear Nikki Giovanni once when she read at Fisk University here in Nashville years and years ago. And I, well, she didn't give this advice to me, but she gave it to the entire room. And she said someone once told her when she was starting to always say yes. So I do too. And she explained a number of different reasons why that may not be good advice. She told a few stories that saying yes kind of got her in trouble. Um, and I'm talking about for events and things,
Right.
that just off ended up being not good things to do. So I always say yes. If someone says, will you do this from an artistic perspective? Will you be involved in this? Will you send us some absolute yes, yes, and yes? So I think that's really good advice for anyone starting out. And then separate from that, my own personal advice would be to you should work really, really hard at whatever that means to you to be real, because you can spot the gatekeepers can spot false artistry wherever it shows itself, whether that be in film or music. We've all heard the expression, oh, he's the real deal,
Hmm.
or she's the real deal, or a band that, oh, they're the real deal. And how you define that for yourself that's what you should strive for. And then when you feel real confident in that, then you need to be very bold, because there are a lot of people out there doing what you do, and what we all do. And if you want to be heard at all, you kind of have to elbow your way in gently, but elbow your way into situations.
Hey, that's really good advice because you're really you have to believe in what we call your brand, which is you.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And a lot of people are really uncomfortable with that. And the people that we all know that aren't in our world, they're kind of uncomfortable with it too, because essentially we're always promoting ourselves, and in sort of normal jobs, one doesn't do that,
Right.
you know. So it's kind of an uncomfortable thing to do, but if you want your work to matter by being heard, listened to, or seen, well, you have to do that. So,
I think of it, Kevin, as your legacy. What do you want your legacy to be?
absolutely.
In 100 years from now, when we're seeing, holographic, graphic Kevin's,
Yeah.
performing,
Right.
that's your legacy.
Yeah. What do you want to leave behind?
What do you want to
Exactly.
leave behind?
Because now more than ever, it's all going to be left behind, isn't it? If we do our job, on Instagram, Facebook, out in the real world, get our world documented, be involved in other things. Um, if it's real, um, that will spread.
And it'll be lasting. It
Yes,
won't
and
it won't
lasting.
be just like, scattering seed on the ground. They'll actually be sown and grown. Um,
Correct. Correct.
Tell me about when you're not being creative. Like, what are your hobbies and your interests? What do you like to do?
Well, I think that that's where my diversity in terms of how I express myself helps, because I really don't have a lot of hobbies. I mean, I'm struggling I could say, oh, well, I play guitar, but that's not a hobby. And I used to fish. I don't anymore, not for any particular reason. I just don't. If I have time away from normal obligations of life,
Hmm.
like maintaining your life, not necessarily having a job, but maintaining your life, where you live, how you live, et cetera, et cetera. I'm either writing poetry or writing songs or um, going out to see other work. So I guess you could say that's a hobby. You
I think
know,
that's a good hobby.
I like to go see films. I like to go hear people read, et cetera, et cetera.
Kevin, when you are in the process of coming up with your writing, do you ever have any challenges? And if you do, like, how do you overcome them? With research or any kind of writer's block or just any roadblock in itself and maybe getting that work published. How do you overcome things?
Well, the last thing that you mentioned is always the most complicated, getting things published. The others, I've just learned a system that works for me, is that I never decide I'm going to write a poem today, or I'm going to take a picture, or I'm going to work on a photograph that I took and turn it into one of my devised photo pieces, or I'm going to think of a new idea for a film.
Hmm.
I move through the world and be very conscious of what I see and what I hear. As an example, if I'm out for a drink at a pub somewhere, and usually the inspiration will come from real life or something that catches my eye on the street and I bend down to pick it up. And I can't really explain the process, but when I look at it, it might remind me of something. And then once you start going down that path, usually for me, a line will occur. And then very shortly, I'll know if that's a seed for something else, or it's a narrative that I'm creating, or if it's going to be a poem or a song or whatever it might be. And with publishing, you just have to know. I'm fortunate enough to go back and receive my MFA, and that was quite the schooling. It was a really good program. It doesn't exist up there at Murray State anymore, and it helped me hone what I do. And also, argue for what I do and convince them that it's of value. And then after their tutelage, be able to convince myself when something is worthy of sending off, or it's best to just sit there until it can morph into something else, perhaps when I revisit it.
Do you keep copious notes? Do you keep
Yes.
spreadsheets of your work? I mean, how do you stay organized?
Well, I do the Moleskine thing. I've been carrying notebooks for, oh gosh, oh, my whole life, virtually since I was a teenager, whatever those might look like, old composition books or whatever. And if they don't travel with me into a space,
Hmm.
then they're always very handy in the car or wherever they might be. I always have a pen and I write on napkins or draw on napkins or whatever the case might be. So I keep track of everything. And periodically, if I just am bored with no fresh ideas, I might flip through my notebooks and then remember, oh, that was really good. I should finish that. Or it strikes me now in a different way. And I'm sure that that's not uncommon.
Do you ever have people that know you say, Kevin, will you write me? Will you write my life? Will you write something about me?
Well, no, no, but I think we're getting there. There's I guess I'm like a number of figures through history that have lived a pub life, which I would not say that I do, but I am in pubs at least once, if not twice a week. And it's been something that I've done for at least the past 5 years. I mean, we all go to clubs and we see bands we like or we do whatever. But
Right.
over the past 5 years, because I'm able to, I'll find a particular place. It used to be Big Trouble Brewing Company here in Gallatin. And it was a unique microbrewery. It was the only brewery in Gallatin where the owners brewed their own beer on site.
Oh.
So I would go there and it was very quiet. They're no longer around for that reason. It was a little too quiet, but a lot of nice people came in there and I started chatting with people and overhearing their stories. And that closed. And so I had to find a new place. And so I went over to Prince Street Pizza and have begun to do the same thing. And I started writing character poems at Big Trouble. And so by the time I came to Prince Street, some people were aware of who I was and that I do occasionally drop a real person by first name only into my work. So they don't ask me to write about them, but they do notice when I'm writing when they've said something and then they'll look at me and kind of like point and wink or something. So that's kind of fun. I really enjoy that. And I know that it can be a very natural outlet. I've
Hmm.
just gotten to this certain point to where I can do that, and I can also tell them this will be in next Thursday's paper,
See,
and
that's
they'll
cool.
get a really big kick out of that.
That is
Now,
cool.
very few of these poems. Well, no, I would say actually all of them are journal worthy, depending on what the journal is.
Right.
Um, but but I don't want to keep them for that. That's part of my role, I think, as Poet Laureate of Gallatin, to just write those. And um, it's kind of like props to the people.
Well, Kevin, tell us where we can find your work. I know that there are many interviews where you've been on, in newspapers and different media like that, but you have YouTube set videos that we can find you on. And do you have a website?
I do. My website is pretty simple. It's Kevin, Kevin, Marshall, Marshall, Chopson.com, Kevin Marshall Chopson. I'm also on Instagram, either by Kevin Chopson. Yeah, both of them are Kevin Chopson. Instagram, Facebook. I have a YouTube channel that is kind of archaic because I really don't want a lot of people going there, meaning it has a weird name. German name, like Briar Haus Writes. Das Kunstwerk und Philosophiehaus von Kevin Marshall Chopson.
I
But if
love
you
that
were to,
name.
yeah, if you were to go to YouTube, just Kevin Marshall Chopson, and there it is. I also have a Vimeo channel if there's something that I want to draw really special attention to, but that's all sort of private. But there and in the Gallatin News, and I do live shows in Gallatin and occasionally in Nashville. I was in the Kindling Arts Festival and over in Ventnor, and sometimes I'm out live in other situations. So I promote those on all social media.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time with us tonight at Briar Haus Writes. And I wish you
Well,
all the best in your future.
well, thank you, and thank you so much for having me.